Tonight's guest is Natalie Marie Dunbar. Natalie is a UX-focused content strategist with a unique blend of skills. Natalie is a content writer, user researcher, social scientist, and she's worked with brands like Anthem, Farmers Insurance, Kaiser Permanente, Walmart, YP.com, as well as several federal agencies, including the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. There must be some interesting stories there. Center for Tobacco Prevention, Food and Drug Administration, and the Veterans Administration. And her first book, and you see a shot of it there, From Solo to Scaled, Building a Sustainable Content Strategy Practice, just came out in July, available from Rosenfeld Media. And we have a promo code for our members there. You can see CSS Meetup. If you go to Rosenfeld Media site, you can use that promo code for any Rosenfeld Media title, but be sure that Natalie's book is in your shopping cart too. So with that, Natalie, please take it away.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. And as I do, I want to say thank you. I know people are dialing in from literally all over the globe. I heard Singapore, I heard a couple of different places, so that's pretty awesome. So we're going to spend a little time talking about hammers, hard hats, and heart, and what it takes to build a content strategy practice. I have not sprinkled a lot of emojis. We were joking about this earlier in this, but I think that the part of it that is the heart is because we're all here and we're so passionate about the work that we do, that I just wanted to be able to capture that as part of the talk and the overall theme. I was going to say something that just popped into my head. I'm going to present. It's a kind of a one-way conversation at first, but I really just want to talk at you about, the experiences that I've had and what led up to the creation of this content strategy practice blueprint, which is kind of the focal point of the book. So we'll spend a little time walking through the 5 components of that blueprint. And as you'll see throughout, we address different tools and approaches that you can take. And of course, go in a lot more detail in the book. But just to give you an overview of some of the experiences I had and kind of what it took to get a couple of practices off the ground. So here we go. So I've worn a lot of hats. I've been an editorial producer in the digital space, senior writer, product manager, user researcher, content strategist, a practice builder, and now a book author. That's what I was going to say. When I say content strategy, okay, I'm old school. I'm kind of what do they call it, an old head in the whole content space. Content strategy and content design, UX writing, all inclusive. Whatever kind of content practice that you're building, I believe that these components will be applicable. So now that I've introduced myself and shared with you all these different hats that I've worn, we're curious folks by nature, and we tend to interact, as you all probably are aware, with cross-functional disciplines and partners from other departments through the life cycle of creating a product or a service. That curiosity of interacting with all these different roles and teams and departmental partners led me to, build empathy as I was trying to understand how to work with these teams and different cross-functional partners. And I realized, and I know Corey Vilhaller has written about how and spoken about how we're connectors, just naturally because of the work that we do. So of course, in having the opportunity at an agency to build my first practice, it started with this question: how do we find more people like you? And I'm a jokester. I tell dad jokes, mom jokes, dad jokes, whatever. And, I'm like, well, I cover a lot of demographics. Exactly what do you mean by more people like me? But this was at an agency where I eventually would build my first practice. And I was brought on to focus on a very specific client project. And as we were having some success with this client who had been very difficult in the past, I was soon asked to consider how content strategy might be able to help other clients. And so I was asked this question, but what that question really meant was, can you help us find another content strategist? Can you help us build out a team? And can you also help us establish this practice within our existing digital experience team so that we can offer content strategy as a service to current and potential clients? But there was something missing from that question, which was, how do we make the practice fit in this already established digital experience team, where we had visual designers, we had an IA. I mean, it's a small team, but we're small but mighty. And I stepped on a lot of toes inadvertently at first, because I came in with, all the vigor and excitement of like, oh, I'm the first content strategist and I'm going to work with the UX lead, this person and that person. And I started asking questions and asking for different artifacts and deliverables. And they were like, yeah, we already did that. We already know about that, So we had to step back and figure out what were our ways of working? How do we work together? And I'll get into that a little bit more as I get into the actual blueprint. But speaking of blueprint, so Merriam-Webster says that, blueprint is a model that provides guidance, like a detailed plan or a program of action. And to build and scale a structure safely and sustainably, you need a plan. This, of course, applies to physical structures, but it also applies to organizational structures. And as I was, transitioning from the agency and going to build practices elsewhere, I would often hear people talk about standing up a practice. I kind of have a thing about building and construction, which is a theme that's used throughout the book. And, so blueprint made sense to me. It was like, okay, well, let's figure out what are the steps that I took to build a practice at the agency. And then when I moved on to a larger organization, the question became, can I scale that? Can I take these steps that I walked through at the agency and then take this and replicate that at a larger organization? And so the blueprint was established. So we're going to take a look at this blueprint that you can use to build or scale content strategy or content design practice at your agency or organization. Or if you've already built one and you're thinking about, hey, maybe we need to kind of retool and refine, or we didn't have a guide like this when we built our practice, which, that was one of the things that I did when I was researching the book, is to understand what was out there in the marketplace that could serve as a guide for building a content strategy practice. So I've heard from people that the book feels like a guide, or I've heard, it's like having a general contractor pull together all the elements of a project that you're building your home and that kind of thing. So we're going to look at this blueprint or a visual plan that's going to guide this creation of this content strategy practice that we want to build. And so there are 5 components to the content strategy practice blueprint. First is making the business case for a content strategy practice. And I will tell you that the other 4 components, I was about to say 5, oh boy, the other 4 components, yeah, I did it anyway, ladder up to this making the business case, because I think we all know that if not weekly, monthly, someone will ask, can you explain to me what it is that you do and why, we should change how we do our processes to create products and services. What is this content strategy practice? Why, why should we make space for this? So we're always making the business case. Next is building strong relationships with cross-functional teams. This is the heart part of the hammers and hard hats, right? Because it's not just about telling people that you're going to come in and save the day, kind of in the way that I did at first when I joined the agency. It's more about how can we work together, and how can I help you understand. Well, how can I ask first, what do you understand about content strategy and content design? Tell you what I mean by content strategy and content design, and then come together and align on how we can help solve content problems that may be, keeping us from being able to deliver our products and services on time, and so on and so forth. I talk a lot in detail in the book about helping people to articulate their pain points. Sometimes they don't know that a problem that they're having can be solved by content strategy or content design. They don't maybe see the connection between a missed goal or KPI that you can ladder content to. So these are the things that we're doing. We're sharing so we can get alignment and get that alignment. And so then we can all cross the whole proverbial finish line together. That's a marathoning metaphor. We'll stay away from those. Let's stay with buildings. So next is creating a foundation of frameworks and tools. And this is the moment where things started to gel at the agency where I built my first practice, because we had to take a step back and get all the players in the room and say, look, this content strategy thing seems like it's a good thing, but where does it fit? What are the milestones? Where are the handoffs? Like, you can't just be a free agent and go off and do this thing and then hand something over. And what do we do with it? Like, how do we integrate this discipline into the rest of our digital experience process? And so once we did that, which I'll talk about a little bit more later, things started to gel. It's like, okay, this is starting to make sense now. I think I understand. And then we're talking about right sizing the practice. So in this usage, I have the note there, we're talking about converting something to an appropriate or optimum size, because right sizing can also mean a reduction in force. That's not what I'm talking about. So we want to be able to create a practice and scale the practice, grow the practice. So that's the right size to meet client or project demand. And then lastly, we're talking about establishing meaningful practice level success measures. So at the project level, we have our KPIs and OKRs and different things, but where I'm talking about more at the practice level, so we can say to our leadership or our cross-functional partners or any other stakeholders, these are the goals that we set for ourselves. These are the ways that we've been able to achieve those goals. We've increased the number of business units that we work with in our organization, or we had this many clients at the agency that signed on for content strategy, and we've grown that to X number. What's meaningful from one organization to another, or from an agency to an in-house team, is going to vary. But we want to make sure that those measures are meaningful, not only to the team or the practitioners that are part of the practice that you're building, but also to those that pay the bills. And so you can ladder that and show that value. All right. So in making the business case for content strategy practice, there's a couple of ways that I've seen this happen. Sometimes it happens organically. Maybe there's a group of content pros that are already working in an agency or organization, and they've got, they're embracing UX best practices and in their work, and they're wanting to become a little bit more formalized in how they apply the discipline of content strategy. This could look like, for those that were at Button, there was a conversation about communities of practice. Sometimes that is the way to start to formalize what a content strategy practice can look like. Sometimes agency may come in-house and introduce the practice, train the current content staff, and then leave them with that training so then they can kind of build upon that practice. As was the case with the client where the agency where I worked, there was a need that was identified for a client that was kind of stuck in a way of producing content that ended up being duplicative. Different departments weren't talking to each other. Plus, there was a highly regulated space. It was in medical and healthcare. And then we ended up, based on the success with that client, as I mentioned earlier, we ended up expanding that offering to other clients in the agency. And then some other times the case is made for you, kind of similar to the agency example where there was a need that was identified, but also there may be a content heavy project like a migration or a replatforming, and it's glaringly clear that a strategic view of content is needed. I encountered this when I was working at Anthem, and we had like probably 20 or so provider websites that we had to migrate from one platform to another. And, before content strategy got involved, it was all over the place. And they were like, nope, we need to take a strategic approach. We had, several Scrum teams, but we hired enough contractors, content strategy contractors, to embed in those teams so that we could have an organized way and a repeatable process to approach these migrations. So whatever the case is, the first component, making this business case, is where you start. You're identifying a need. You're showing examples, perhaps, of how a strategic approach to content can add value to the experiences that you're creating, and ultimately add value to the business or the agency where your practice is being built. So a question that you might consider when you're thinking about this business case is, who might you have to make that business case with in your agency or organization? Christina Halverson talks about finding sponsors. Sometimes it's a director who has other content capabilities, maybe admins who do the work of adding content to the CMS, UX writers and editorial folks who focus on, the deep work of the grammar and the voice and tone, but still recognizes that there's a need to think about content across an experience, the end-to-end flow, and having that purview. So those might be as an example of some of the folks that you might find, these sponsors or these helpers or these other people that are just really passionate about content, and they can be really strong allies as you're building that business case. Next up is building strong relationships with cross-functional teams. So introducing content strategy and content design and articulating its benefits, especially on cross-functional teams, design teams, it's crucial to establishing longevity. So this component of the blueprint speaks to the goals of how we work together and how work will get done. So at the earlier stages, you want to ensure that as many members of your cross-functional teams that you work with understand, as I said earlier, how content strategy will impact their work. And even before that, understand what they think it is, and then talk about how you define it within your organization. And then ultimately, you want to make sure that everyone sees the value that this strategic approach to content brings. And so a question that might come up here with this component is, which cross-functional teammates do you think are important to build relationships with when building a content strategy practice? It may be that it's not a cross-functional team so much that if you're not embedded, but it might be departmental partners. If you're seated in the UX organization, you might have partners in marketing that you'll be working with that need to understand and align and build relationships with, which can be a challenge because there's kind of ownership of content and, you know, what do we call each team and how are our approaches different? But I like to talk about when you have different approaches to content, say from a marketing and a UX sides of the house, and you think about whatever goal it is that you're working on, that becomes what I call the monster in the room. And that is the thing that is causing the angst. And then you figure out how you're going to work together to slay that monster. So there's that little thing. All right. And so then we're talking about, in our next component, creating a foundation of frameworks and tools. So as I talked about in the previous component, involving and collaborating with cross-functional teammates to assure alignment is critical. It's also it's critical to the previous component as well as this one, because here is where, when I talked about earlier, process framework is what I call it, where we're getting as many people in the room that are involved in the product development, new product, whatever you want to call it, digital experience process, getting all those people together and helping them to understand what are the stages of product development, what is the duration of those stages, what are the teams responsible for activities and deliverables, and then what are those critical overlaps or handoffs between those teams. You can do this by creating, the first time I did it, it was a whiteboard, a bunch of markers and Post-it notes, my favorite tools. And we kind of drew out like a chart, like a Gantt chart. And we were able to identify the different handoffs and touch points where each team or each discipline within the cross-functional team would either overlap or be dependent upon the activities of another team, so on and so forth. It helped to visualize that so that we could see gaps in much the way that we kind of audit content. We audited our process and then tried to identify where content strategy would fit in or overlap. Another approach that I talk about in the book is you could do kind of a service blueprint approach, where instead of mapping out actual customer touch points, you're mapping out touch points where there's a need for content strategy. Or you might be looking at, again, each discipline in that service blueprint model and look at being able to identify what stages, deliverables and other things are needed, and how you can work together to make that an end-to-end and seamless process. So with this component, you might be thinking or asking, what kind of frameworks and tools do you think would be useful when building a content strategy or content design practice? Again, your mileage may vary depending on where you're working, what kind of organization you're seated in, how you're organized will impact that. If your content team is a service to marketing, UX, and maybe even the C-suite, in that you might have someone that's writing white papers and that kind of thing, it's going to be useful for you to think about what tools make sense when you're focusing on the UX content strategy part of things. By the way, I live and breathe UX. I've been delighted to hear practitioners from within and outside of the UX space say that, I'm reading this and I'm thinking that this could apply to any type of discipline or practice that you want to build within an organization. So if you're not a practicing content strategist or designer, or if you're not seated in UX, know that this is applicable and usable to you as well. All right. So right sizing the practice to meet client or project demand. Here we're talking about thinking beyond your current plans and projects that are right in front of you and considering how you might intentionally plan for the future expansion, scaling, and doing so can help you ensure that your practice grows and keeps pace as the demand within your business or agency or organization grows. It also helps you to make sure that you're kind of future-proofing the practice as the business changes as well. So again, going back to establishing the value of content and learning how to articulate that to different cross-functional partners, departmental partners, teammates, leaderships, whoever needs to know, so you can kind of keep pace and grow as your business or agency continues to grow. So here with this component, a question you might ask is, what factors do you think are important to consider when determining the right size for your practice? I gave some examples. There are, many different factors and different ways that you might measure this and consider, different variables that you might consider when determining what's the right size. I've mostly encountered just a kind of a growth in demand, like, hey, can we get some of that content strategy help over here? Because we heard that you guys do this, this, and this, or you folks do this, this, and this, and we'd like a little bit of that. So, can you grow your practice by deepening the skills on the bench, so to speak? And maybe expanding, if you can't, add more resources at a certain time because there's no budget, is there a way for you to add skills to the existing team so that you can then take on more work in a way that's sustainable, though? Understand with any growth, it's so important to make sure that you're growing in a way that's sustainable. Sustainable is not just, hey, we're getting so big, we don't have room for, this many people, or we don't, we don't have enough licenses for the CMS or whatever. It's also about the people that are at the center of your practice and making sure that they are able to sustain the growth without burning out. All right. And then for our last component, so I talked about this a little bit in the intro, establishing meaningful success measures at the practice level. So this is a lot less about KPIs and similar measures at the project level, and more about OKRs, objectives and key results, and other measures that are meaningful to the success of content strategy as a practice. So in trying to figure out what measures are relative and important, we want to be able to demonstrate how the discipline has or can contribute to the overall success of your organization or your agency. Things like establishing practice level SLAs and between the practice and content stakeholders, for example, and keeping track of how many times you delivered, within that, stated SLA. Things like turnaround times for reviewing content. Oh boy, there's so many examples. Keeping a project track, establishing a project tracker, and then keeping tabs on how many times you've met your project goals over a period of time. I spoke with someone who measured success by the number of, I think I mentioned this earlier, the number of business units. Maybe the first year the practice was established, 1 or 2 different business units were asking to work with content strategy. A year later, that number doubled, and then it grew again. There's so many different creative and ways that you can do that. You can also take an aggregate of your project level work and say, hey, we had this many projects, and among those projects, we hit these KPIs this many times, but whatever. What is important to understand here is that we're measuring the success of the practice, and showing again how it has or can contribute to the overall success of the organization. And so here you might ask a question like, what measurements do you think would be considered meaningful? Mileage may vary depending on where you work, what vertical you're in. But when you're gauging the success of your content strategy practice, this is a question that you might begin with as you're trying to begin determining what is meaningful in terms of measurement of success. And this is also a good place to circle back to your cross-functional teammates, to find out from, say, visual design, hey, did you, when you set up your objectives and key results as a team, what kind of measurements did you consider? What's important to leadership? And just finding that out, and also having them have some input into the establishment of those measures, because even though we want to show that our practice that we've built is successful, we also want to show that we can play well with others and add to the overall success of whatever product, service, experience that we're building. And so wherever you are in this practice building journey, there are 3 persistent principles that you might want to consider, and probably should consider, as you're practice building. The first one is always be educating. You're always going to be called on to educate or re-educate clients, stakeholders, team members about the value that a content strategy or content design practice can bring to your digital experience capabilities. I love office hours for this, because people have a way to, get in there and start to understand what it is that we bring to the table, even if they don't have, like, in our organization, we don't have content strategists embedded in every business unit or pillar. So it's nice when folks come to office hours and they're curious. They know that they have a content conundrum, as I like to call it. But they also are curious about, like, how does this whole thing work? And really, not just those that are needing to have content questions answered. Anybody who's interested in learning more about content strategy will benefit from you always being able to kind of bring that education piece to help them see and understand in real time what kinds of problems we tackle and solve. Next, back to those goals and success measures, keep these measures in mind as the size and scope of your practice evolves and changes. This ensures that you're tracking together with your other cross-functional teammates, as well as leadership and other stakeholders, in ways that demonstrate how your work together is creating impact, positive impact. So, this might, again, look like working together with others to establish OKRs that apply to all the disciplines, or, where it makes sense, all the disciplines within your user experience team or whatever your team is called. And then finally, a little bit of the heart part of this: you're not alone, especially if even if you've been doing the work of content strategy for a long time. If you've had an opportunity to go to attend these meetups like we're at tonight, I was telling Larry and Paula before everyone joined how during the pandemic, this was a lifeline for me. Like, it wasn't just about talking shop. It was like being in community, even virtually, where there were like-minded people For those who attended Button just last week, how amazing that was, whether they're in person or virtually. From meetups to conferences, there's so many vibrant content strategy and content design community that create spaces for us and hold spaces for us so we can come together. We learn ways to pair with and learn from each other and with our cross-functional teammates. And we're here to help. And that's a beautiful thing, is knowing that we're not alone out here in this practice building work that we're doing. And the work that we're doing is important. I can't believe that in 2022, I guess we're all going to have job security for a while, because I'm still explaining to people from time to time. All right, so here we go. This is what this is. This is what content design and content strategy is. This is what we do. Here's how we can help you. Again, always educating. And with that, that is the blueprint. Grab a copy of the book if you're so inclined. Use the promo code to get 20% off. That's direct from Rosenfeld. And that code expires on January 1st of 2023, which is like next week in my mind, but it's coming up. And thanks for spending your time with me. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thanks, Natalie. Yeah, we've got some questions queued up, and feel free to keep dropping them in the chat, everyone. Let's just jump right to them. Crystal had a question. Are practice leaders usually supervisors as well, or can they be senior individual contributors?
So when I was thinking about what to call the book, I came up with the from solo to scale part. The solo part was representative of me as a kind of senior level individual contributor at the agency where I worked and built my first practice. The scaling part came later when I joined a larger organization and we were rebuilding a team that had once been in place and then later had disbanded and then came back together again. You can be a practice builder, really, I think, from any level within a team or organization. That's where, if you're a solo practitioner or a individual contributor, it may be powerful to help to find those sponsors that I talked about earlier, or those helpers. As someone brought up the Mr. Rogers talks about when things get big and scary, find the helpers. I giggled at that, hearing it at the conference last week, because I actually wrote about that in the book, because this is not easy work to do all the time. People can talk about, oh yeah, I know content strategy is awesome and I know we need it. And then you talk about what it takes to actually build a practice up, one that's sustainable. It's like, whoa, okay, that's a lot more than I thought. So find those helpers. If you're that senior individual contributor, find the sponsors, find people who are passionate about content and may not even be able to articulate it in the way that you can, but you can have a conversation with them and know that at some point when you're a content strategist and you're not in the room, or content designer that's not in the room, whether it's virtual or physical room, that person will become an advocate for you and say, hey, wait a minute, we have a content strategy practice, we have content designers, let's get them involved. And those helpers that you established at the very beginning will continue to be your allies as your practice grows and scales.
Cool. And Crystal had another question as well. I like this one too. Although titles vary widely, in your experience, what is the difference between an old school content strategy practice lead and a content design craft lead?
So this one always gets me, because I wrestled back and forth whether or not to speak to content strategy, content design. And in the middle of all this, well, actually, as I was wrapping up on the chapter work in the book, our titles changed at my current work from content strategy to content strategist to content designer. I don't know that I draw hard lines. I do have examples of how content strategy has been defined by some, and how content design has been defined by some, how UX writing fits in with all that. As I said during the talk, I think you can put content fill in the blank practice builder and it works for whatever flavor of content. I think people are moving towards the content design title. I've heard folks say that it helps us to be more integrated into larger design organizations, and I can see that because our approaches are similar. Writing is designing. I mean, we're just doing it with words. So I think I don't know. I hope I answered that sufficiently, but I don't know that the title necessarily dictates the success or changes the approach to how you build a practice. You can refine these steps in a way that makes sense for your situation.
Yeah, we're not going to hold your feet to the fire on a definitive answer there.
Please don't. I'll mess it up.
A work in progress. Yeah. And Candace had a question. Do you make use of a RACI matrix when advocating like who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed when you're in your workflows?
Wow. Just had a conversation with a colleague about RACIs today, and the comment that kind of got us all giggling is that we spent a lot more time arguing about who's the R, A, and the C, and the I than once it's implemented and it doesn't get looked at. I do talk about RACIs and also RAPID in the book to show that there are different ways that you can help use those tools to define roles and responsibilities, whether they're within the practice that you've built or how you may partner with others within the organization. So again, I always use the marketing and UX example because that's kind of the world that I live in and have lived in for quite some time, where there's content and copy things that happen in the marketing world that may be complementary but are different from what's happening in the UX world. So we use the RACI as a guideline. They can be useful, but I find sometimes they can add more contention, and it's usually when we're trying to figure out who does what.
Nice.
Yeah.
Great, thanks. And Bill has a question. Yes, have you seen success addressing these components? The five, he's talking about when you were running through the list of 5, addressing these components in the order that you presented them, or have you seen success varying the order across experiences? Just if there's any order of operations to that.
I laid out the steps that way because that's how the approach was taken when I built the first practice at an agency. And when I was going back through and going through my notes and just chatting with colleagues from that experience, it's like, yeah, we did this, we did this, we did this, we did this, and it made sense. It's kind of a jump in where you are, though. You may be more in a more advanced space of having created a solid team, maybe a community of practice within your organization, and you don't need to make the business case. Maybe that part's already done. You can go in order, especially if you're starting from scratch. I think that would be helpful. However, you may find yourself working back and forth between the components, not necessarily in the order that they're presented, and that's okay. I provided a checklist in the back of the book so that you can kind of take a look at everything holistically and go, okay, do we have this? Okay, we got that. We don't have to do that. We can do this. We do this. And you might find that within the theme of one of those components, there's something that may not be written about in the book, but that's like, it fits in, and you may have to do it here's an example. If you work in a highly regulated space like healthcare, and you're thinking about success measures, I think back to my days at Anthem, where we also had an entire external process, depending on the state, of checks and balances. And we could count as success the number of times, or the number of times we didn't have to keep going back to the state. Like when we nailed it the first time, or, oh my goodness, we have to go back because they've dinged us on all these different things. As you start to work with those state agencies and organizations, and you start to see more of a success metric saying that, you know, we've hit our target or whatever it is, that's a, you know, a way that, you know, that you could kind of add something a little bit more specific to the whole success measure piece. That was just an example off the cuff, but it is something that I had to deal with in real life.
Great. Next question is from Zach. Do you have any go-to examples when making the business case for content strategy?
Go-to examples. So in the agency world, I had a creative director who was kind of over the digital experience team, who understood, you know, the value that content strategy could bring. However, with other clients, we thought, well, they want us to work on a web redesign, and maybe they even had, you know, a more of a full traditional because we were an ad agency that had a digital experience team. It actually started as a web design org way back. Anyway, so we would bring case studies. We do, you know, we would definitely inventory and audit. And if we didn't have something that we could show from another client, where we could indicate, you know, here's how we grew this metric or that thing, we could show them though how, you know, if we change these things in, you know, in your digital experience, whether it was app or whatever, we can help you achieve these goals that you have. In-house, I think, oh my goodness, how many times in one particular situation I'm thinking about where we continually had to go back and keep explaining what it was that we were doing and why it was important. What we ended up doing is we created one deck that had examples where we were incrementally able to show the positive impact and value that we brought to the organization. And we created, it was a virtual roadshow that we did, and we got in front of as many business units as we could to help them understand what it was we were doing, what is the value. Here's an example of what we did or what we can do, because sometimes you're kind of making that future state you know, argument. This is how we move the needle, so on and so forth. And that actually ended up working out really well, because we were sharing the same story with different business units, but it was consistent. So no matter which one of our team of 7 was presenting, it was always the same consistent story. And then people started to talk about it across business units. I talk with my hands a lot. I'm just realizing that. So yeah, that's I hope that answered Zach's question.
I think so. Next question is from Hillary. She kind of sets out a scenario and wants your thoughts on it. She says that the content strategy team that she built and managed inside an organization wasn't part of a bigger UX team. Instead, they worked most closely with the subject matter experts, and then got a ton of pushback. In retrospect, she thinks the thing she should have done was to get buy-in up front from a senior leader, and then have that senior leader communicate to the SMEs that content strategy was now a key part of the content getting content published. Have you seen similar scenarios like that?
Yeah. I don't know why it is in all these heavily regulated spaces, but healthcare, I've been in healthcare a lot. And that is definitely a place where it helps to have a sponsor, or, a stakeholder or a member of leadership, to kind of help whoever the SMEs are, whoever you're working with, to understand the way, what it is that you're bringing to the table, and how to work most efficiently with you. And we recognize that you are the subject matter experts, yes, and we're just taking, someone brought this example, I can't remember where I heard this, but it was like, I have written this explanation of this, I don't know, medical procedure, whatever it was, and this was the SME talking, but it had been written a while back and then needed to be brought into present day, so that voice and tone and different things that may not have been considered when it was first created, now that there was a content strategy team practitioner on board, it's like, okay, this is great, this is just how we're going to need to alter it so that, or augment it so that it fits in with the bigger experience that we're trying to create, so that there's consistency. That's when you start to bring in and help people to understand what are best practices for the work that we do.
Thanks. And actually, Hillary had a follow-on to that too. She said, and she now advises clients to involve HR to make sure that content collaboration is built into the SME's jobs. Do you do that too, or what do you think of that?
I have not done that, but that's brilliant. I like that. Yeah. I want to say that I heard somebody bring that up at Button last week in a talk. It's not a bad idea. I know from the standpoint of this of an agency, which of course, again, that was smaller, there was a point when we were actually going through rebranding and replatforming of our own digital experience, and rebranding the agency itself, where we actually did say, hey, office manager, hey, HR, everybody needs to be on board with what we mean when we talk about, consistent voice and tone and establishing an end-to-end experience beyond digital touch points. So whether you called or walked in or whatever, you were having the experience that we were trying to embody digitally. We were able to, establish that in a physical space, in a physical sense. And so that's the only close experience I've had with that, where it's not your traditional like UX or whatever, but we involved everybody in that process.
Nice. And Jane has a question. Do you ever list out content gaps? What, like for example, what customers need but can't find on the website or the app through an audit? Is that part of your process?
Yes. So in my book, because there's been so many other brilliant people who have written about content audits and the actual tools that we use at the project level. I didn't talk a lot about that in my book, but in my day-to-day, yes. I think every practice I've either worked in or stood up started with, all right, let's get an assessment of where we are. How much content do we have? Where does it live? And what current state goals are we trying to achieve with this content? Is it missing? That's where the gaps come in. And then what future state goals are we trying to hit? And what content do we need to help us get there? Or what content do we need to get rid of? I think that is vitally important to understand where you are and what you have when you're, at the project level, and to incorporate that as a best practice at the practice level. That's a lot of practice.
Hey, I just want to point out you're getting a lot of love in the chat too, and there's some great comments in there as well. But I'm just going to stick to asking the questions. But I'll save the chat and share it with you, Natalie, and
Oh,
drop
thank
it
you.
in the Slack as well. But I want to make sure we get to all the questions. So
Sure.
next one is Mariana asks, what types of deliverables, speaking of struggling with language, what types of deliverables did you showcase in your content strategy roadshow presentation? She says, I find that when trying to educate other teams about the value of content strategy, that people want to see examples of tangible deliverables. I often get this asked from account peeps who are trying to write content strategy into a scope of work.
Interesting. So inventories and audits can make people's eyes glaze over because it's a spreadsheet, or however people do it in a different way, but usually it's a spreadsheet. I would, especially when I was presenting to a client, and even trying to pitch, content strategy as an add-on to their contract, for example, we would do a spot inventory and audit and say, this is the research that we've done. This is what we know about your digital experience. Got this many pages, whatever we could find out without being too invasive, but, hey, we're doing our homework. And here are some actionable steps that we think that we can help you make and take to improve the overall experience of your, users, customers, whatever. That really seemed to help. So there would be the screenshot, the gratuitous screenshot of, here's this audit that nobody really wants to dig into except us because we get excited about it. But here's a narrative now that goes with that. And we hit, we agree on some touch points that we know that maybe in, meeting with the client initially that they've stated, we have a problem with X, and we go, I wonder if that's a content thing. And we go kind of looking for that information. Again, we're connecting the dots and helping them to see, content strategy or content design could actually help me with this. Okay. As much as we're able to provide any data that is relevant to KPIs and different things that they may have shared with us, we are trying to, again, draw those dotted lines so they understand. We can help them understand and help them see the value that we bring. Nice. So audits, inventories, a narrative to help kind of tell the story. Sometimes we even do have to kind of explain what it is that we do and what the approach is. But it's usually a part of, if it's in-house, it's usually focused just on the work of content strategy and content design. Agency side, I've had more experience where it's like, okay, let me explain to you what it is, and then tell you our approach and how we found these things we're about to show you. But it's always, something that's relevant and tangible to whether it's a product team or, a client that you're working with, making those deliverables relevant to them, and not so complicated that they can't understand and see the value and make that connection for themselves.
Right. What's all the questions in there? Natalie, I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on, or not elaborate, but if you have any more examples of the difference in practice and like how things manifest in the agency versus in-house setting, because I know you've had a lot of experience in both. You've talked a lot already about other examples, but are there any things you haven't talked about yet that are good insights about the difference between those two kinds of practice?
Oh my goodness. I years ago sat on a panel and we had an agency versus in-house discussion, and it was so lively. I think my agency experience was kind of unique because, again, it was a web design company that grew into a full service advertising. I'm talking TV, radio, everything. And then also had this very vibrant legacy digital experience team, because that's how they had started. I think for me, in that world, where I started was, similar to the how do we find more people like you. There was another account person that was like, what exactly is it that you do? Because I don't get it. And then trying to, because we had another a team that was involved with, they focused on social media and content marketing, and didn't understand like, well, like what are you doing that we don't do? And then when I would show them, you know, an inventory and an audit and personas and different things that I would work on with my UX lead partner, they would go run screaming from from my desk, like, oh, okay, never mind, we don't want to know. But there were times too that we could, we had a kind of a handoff between our UX team when we had a client that also needed, you know, someone to help them with their social media and their content marketing and that kind of thing. So then we would work together on establishing an overarching content strategy. I remember auditing, oh my goodness, I think it was a utility client. And we even, our audit was so detailed that we audited bill inserts for voice and tone because they had had a big issue with their customer base where they had, you know, increased rates and this kind of thing. And it was a big brouhaha. And we literally sat down with them and said, you know, your voice over here in your, you know, your web and your app experience is different from your voice and tone. And yes, that needs to shift from, you know, depending on where you're encountering and where you're engaging with a brand or a service. But then you have this really legalistic, you know, you're trying to be a little bit funny, but, you know, people don't want to laugh about their rates going up or whatever it was. And so you have the room to kind of focus on, you know, a client and see things from start to finish. Whereas in-house, you know, not where I am currently. We start, we finish, just going. But I have been in situations where we've done the work of content strategy, we've done the inventory, we've done the audit, we've done the presentation to the project manager, I'll be okay later, product managers, whoever's involved. And then it kind of just sits on a shelf. It doesn't go anywhere. Sometimes I think too, you know, in an agency, good and bad, you hopefully have a nice, you know, client base and it's growing. Sometimes it becomes stagnant though. Not every client, if you're offering all these different services, not every client is going to need or want content strategy as part of their whatever contract that they're signing. In-house can look a little different because now you're talking about having to sustain the practice maybe in between major projects, but there's always work to be done, I think, where you're, you know, updating style guides and, you know, going back through the steps of the blueprint, for example. And a process that I talk about in the book is retooling. And, you know, you're kind of like checking your content strategy or content design toolbox to make sure that the tools that you have in place to practice are still serving your needs and meeting your needs. And maybe we need to retool. Maybe we need to think about, you know, getting access to some other platform to help us with whatever. I don't know. I think in-house it's easier to, when things kind of slow down, it's easier to kind of not make up work, but there's always work to be done to keep the practice going. Those are just like examples off the cuff. You know, as you're building in either agency or in-house spaces, I think one of the things to consider is that, you know, again, you're working with clients, even though the folks in-house can be considered your internal clients, definitely working with clients in an agency situation, you've got maybe one or two chances to kind of pitch them on this whole content strategy thing. It's a yes or a no. And then if it's a no, then hopefully there's another client to move on to. So that can be a little perilous unless that's your your agency's focus. So I'm again talking about an advertising agency, but there are of course digital agencies out there that's all they focus on. So hopefully there'll be that, repeat client work that's happening.
Oh. And there was a whole chat going on in the about whether we should host a whole panel, and we might have to invite you back, I think, because it sounds like there's a lot of interest in that.
Cool.
Hey, Paula, so we're running out of questions and it's getting a little late. Do you want to wrap up, or is there anything last that you want to talk about? Or
No, other than unless anyone has anything else. And and yeah, as you just mentioned, that idea of kind of the differences between working in-house and consulting is something because I've kind of done both, and I think it's an interesting topic, and so it
definitely
it kind of has spurred a little conversation about whether that would be a good event for us to have. So thank you for that. And of course, I'm always happy to hear any discussion of inventories and audits. So,
oh yeah. Oh yeah.
So with that, I guess thank you so much, Natalie. This is really super fascinating. And thank you everybody for joining us. Please buy Natalie's book. Please come back to our events again. We love seeing you, and we really appreciate our little content strategy Seattle community, and we definitely would love to see you again. So,
and I threw my LinkedIn in the chat.
Oh, perfect. Great.
And the handle there on the thank you slide, the literati, that's on Instagram and Twitter. Please reach out. I love chatting with people and hearing from folks, and just like talking shop. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Natalie. That was great.
You're welcome. Everyone have a wonderful evening.